This podcast was recorded on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation.
Hello and welcome to The Real Story with Joe Hildebrand. It's real, there are stories, and I'm Joe Hildebrand. This week, Dutton drops the N-bomb. Yes, we'll be looking at the real story behind Peter Dutton's power plant plan. Will he really go nuclear? Can he really go nuclear? Does he even want to go nuclear? Plus, we're all hanging out for rate cuts, and Albo needs a rate cut more than anyone, because without one, he's probably not going to win the next election. But will we actually get a rate cut, and could we actually get rate rises? A couple of economists think so. That is terrifying. And I'll be delving back in time to give you the real story as to what happened when the Beatles came to town 60 years ago this month. Yes, Dutton has literally gone nuclear. Peter Dutton on Wednesday announced not just that he's going to pursue nuclear power to get Australia to net zero emissions by 2050. We knew that already. But he's actually revealed the locations of all these nuclear power plants that he is now saying he's going to build. Have a listen.
Today we announce 7 locations that we have looked at in great detail over a long period of time that can host new nuclear sites. I want to make sure that the Australian public understands today that we have a vision for our country to deliver cleaner electricity, cheaper electricity and consistent electricity. This is a plan for our country which will underpin a century of economic growth and jobs for these communities.
Now, the first thing to know about Dutton's plan is it's not going to happen. It is not a plan. He has no plan, or he has a plan, but it's scribbled on the back of a beer coaster. He's written down 7 locations. He's got no costings. He hasn't actually said, how much any of these reactors are going to cost, let alone all of them. And the time frame for these reactors being built would mean that by the time it was time to cut the ribbon on them, Peter Dutton would probably have retired from politics. But first, let's get down to brass tacks. There are 2 nuclear power plants proposed for Queensland, 2 for New South Wales, 1 in Victoria and 1 each in South Australia and WA. All of them are for former or currently about to expire power plants, and basically you just replace the source of power. So you take a coal-fired power plant, you put a nuclear generator there instead, and you use the existing infrastructure, you recycle that to produce the power. You use the existing transmission system, and that's meant to save money because you don't have to build huge wires to where the wind is blowing or the sun is shining, and that means you don't have angry farmers saying, "Get off my land, get off my property, I don't want that giant power pole sticking in front of my cows," whatever. That seems all well and good. The problem is that the conventional nuclear reactors, which would be in Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria, take about 15 years to build. And it's a fair bet that we're going to be running out of power well before then. In fact, that's Dutton's whole complaint, that we don't have enough baseload power, so he's going to get it by nuclear. He says he's going to infill the interim with gas, and gas is great as a transitional fuel. I'm all with him on that. But this means 15 years down the track before we even get the first little kilowatt from any of these power stations. That's the conventional ones. Then there are the small modular reactors, right? These are very exciting new, well, they are what they say, small modular reactors that you can use to power up smaller areas. So not the huge things that you see on The Simpsons. And these are what he's proposing for South Australia and Western Australia. There is just one small catch. They don't exist. The technology is just not there yet to make them commercially viable. It might come online in 5 or 10 years. That'd be fantastic. That could be a game changer, or it might not. It's a bit like hydrogen. Could be everything, could be nothing, could be something in between. So we've got, at best, 15 years, according to the CSIRO, to get these conventional nuclear reactors online. They'd cost about $8.5 billion each. Don't take my word for it. Take the CSIRO's. And that's if there are no cost overruns, of course, which there will be. And in Britain, we've seen a project just have eye-watering cost blowouts. Or you've got these SMRs, these small modular reactors, which don't exist yet. That's just the starting point. Queensland, New South Wales, and Victoria have all already come out and said that they're not going to lift their ban on nuclear energy. Yes, there is a moratorium on nuclear energy in Australia. It's enforced by the states that would require an act of parliament to lift that ban to even approve it, let alone start work on it. Every single one of the leaders of this state, not counting Stephen Miles because he's not going to be the leader of Queensland come November, but even Peter Dutton's own colleague in the Queensland LNP, David Christofouli, he said, nah, we're not lifting the ban. So even his own colleague in the Queensland LNP is saying, we're going to keep the ban. It's a brand new government that hasn't even been elected yet, but will be. Chris Minns has also said, nah, we're not going to lift the ban. This is despite, it should be said, Chris Minns being very close with a very sensible Australian Workers' Union, which is actually pro-nuclear energy. If any Labor Premier was going to get on board with nuclear, it'd be Chris Minns. He's not. He said he's not going to lift the ban. And of course, in the People's Republic of Victoria, they're not lifting any ban and the Libs aren't getting elected anytime soon. These guys could honestly run over a cat and still get a landslide election victory, it seems. Victoria is just a weird joint. So Dutton's nuclear plan is not going anywhere. It is dead on arrival before it's left the house. So why does he keep going on about it? I remember talking even to Scott Morrison in the previous government, where nuclear was the love that dare not speak its name. The right of the Liberal Party and the Nationals, they all loved nuclear. Matt Canavan was the only one who had the balls to say it out loud. And now we've gone from a bit where, we'd love to do nuclear, but Australia's just not ready. We can't actually say that we want to do it because, freaks everybody out. We've gone from that coalition just a couple of years ago to Peter Dutton, who is bringing up nuclear of his own volition, not refusing to rule it out, not being pressured by the government, not being boxed into a corner, say, hey, you going to do nuclear or not? Big scary nuclear. He's actually come out on the front foot and said, damn right, we're going to go nuclear, both literally and metaphorically. So why? Why are they doing this? Well, the thing is that Peter Dutton doesn't actually need to build any nuclear power plants. And I'm pretty sure he knows that he's not going to build any nuclear power plants. What he wants is for everybody to be talking about nuclear power plants, because that means he can talk about power. And as long as he keeps talking about power and keeps the government talking about power, that means he can keep hammering home the fact that power bills have risen, the fact that the $275 off your power bill that Labor, I'm sorry to say, rather foolishly pledged before the election is probably not going to happen. It will be, thanks to their $300 vouchers, more than $275 less. So it'll be less than it otherwise would be, but it's not going to be less than it was. So Peter Dutton is doing with nuclear power the same thing that he did with The Voice, which is getting the government talking about what he wants to talk about. He wants to be playing a home game. He wants to be fighting on his turf. And his turf, as we know from poll after poll after poll, is cost of living. And there is nothing more emblematic of the rising cost of living than rising power prices. It's a phenomenon called bill shock. It means that even though it might not be your highest cost, it might not even be what you're most worried about. Most people have been worried about paying the rent, paying the mortgage. Personally, I'm shitting myself. But when you go and open up a bill and the last bill came, 3 months ago, then that means there's a bigger jump than you're expecting. It's not this incremental thing that keeps creeping up. So you're like a frog in the boiling water and you don't notice that it's heated to boiling point until it's too late because it's so gradual. You get a shock because it's jumped because the last time you checked was 3 months ago or 6 months ago or whatever it might be. That is why power is so, powerful. And it's also powerful because it's a cultural war weapon as well, because you can then, rightly or wrongly, and a lot of the case, it's actually something else entirely that is driving it, but you say, see, this power bill is going up because this government's got an ideological obsession with renewables. It's got an ideological obsession with the Paris climate target for 2030. This crazy ideology is forcing your power bills up. So you say this ideology is causing a practical harm to you and the government's obsessed with it and it doesn't understand what you are going through. That's a really powerful weapon. And that has been the end of almost every single Australian Prime Minister over the past 15 years. You could argue that Kevin Rudd, Julia Gillard, Tony Abbott, Malcolm Turnbull were all basically casualties of the climate wars.
I'm very happy for the election to be a referendum on energy, on nuclear, on power prices, on lights going out, on who has a sustainable pathway for our country going forward. As I said before, this Prime Minister has no vision for our country because he can't manage the government on a day-to-day basis.
He is reeling the government in to talk about what he wants to talk about. Every time the government has a go at Peter Dutton for talking about nuclear, that gives him the platform to talk about rising power costs, to talk about the government pursuing what it says is an ideological crusade towards renewable energy that's proving more expensive and not reliable. So the real plan for Peter Dutton's nuclear power plant plan has nothing to do with nuclear power plants at all. It's just to do with power. Speaking of power, Peter Dutton is getting closer to it. Yes, even before the big nuclear announcement was made this week, there was a poll conducted by the Resolve Political Monitor, very reputable, in the 9 newspapers, and it found that for the first time, Peter Dutton had pulled ahead of Anthony Albanese as preferred Prime Minister. Now, this is really significant because even when the opposition is leading the government in the two-party preferred stakes, it's usually very uncommon for the opposition leader to be the preferred Prime Minister to the actual Prime Minister. And there's a bit of a clue in that because the Prime Minister is someone who people have seen and are familiar with being in the role. And so they say, yeah, he's doing a pretty good job. The opposition leader, you have to actually go out of your way to picture them, if you like, in a brand new suit, a brand new set of clothes, and actually put them in a job that they've never held and you've never seen them in, and then assess them in this imaginary job. I mean, how can you have someone say, oh, Peter Dutton's a preferred Prime Minister, even though I've never seen him act in the role of Prime Minister? So once he's ahead on that metric, that is a big worry. And it also means that the government loses its biggest weapon against the opposition, which is you don't want to change horses in midstream. Look at our guy. He's the one you know. This is the face you know and trust. This is, what it says on the tin. It is going to be very, very difficult. They have their own challenge ahead, which is whether or not the RBA cuts interest rates before they go to the polls. They basically are relying on a completely independent statutory body over which the executive government has no control except to appoint the governor. They just have to wait and see and hope that the RBA cuts rates before they call an election, or at least there's widespread speculation and expectation that the RBA will cut rates when they call an election. Now, the earliest the RBA could possibly cut rates is probably around February, maybe March, maybe May. That seems to be what most people are saying. There's a saying that if you laid all the economists in the world end to end, they still wouldn't reach a conclusion. But a couple of economists have said there could actually be a rate rise before then. And one who has got an amazing form of getting all these predictions right, even though he's in the minority, has said there could be actually 2 rate rises before the end of this year. That would be disastrous. And if that looks like a serious prospect of happening, it almost doesn't matter whether the government calls an election. So you've got Peter Dutton going all in on nuclear power plants that will never be built. And you've got Anthony Albanese going all in on a rate cut that may never come. This election is going to be a hell of a ride. Quick little side note on the real story. I'm going to have to do a shout out to Media Watch and maybe send them an invoice because I've become a regular on the show and not in the way that it usually happens. The last couple of weeks, they've actually been saying I'm right about stuff. So they're actually fact-checking the real story and finding out that it's the real story. This, I have to stress, is terrible for my reputation. How on earth am I supposed to show my face at Sky News if you keep doing this to me, Paul Barry?
For Sky to suggest the AFD is not a far-right party is not just alarming, it is preposterous. Co-host Joe Hildebrand finally shut it down.
The AFD are a nasty bunch of really bad people. I'm just saying, for the sake of this show and for the sake of your fine reputations, I wouldn't be praising AFD as a bunch of freedom fighters and a bunch of wonderful people.
At least there is one adult in the studio.
This is this really scary far-right party in Germany, which quite frankly has a bit of a history with far-right parties. And while you could say that your Nigel Farages, your Donald Trumps, even your Marine Le Pens are just the kind of stock standard, slightly xenophobic populist right, and that appeals to a lot of people, fair enough. It's one big world. Everyone's got their own opinions. These guys, the AFD, are seriously bad hombres.
But we have some bad hombres here.
In fact, one of their leading members was expelled just recently for using a Nazi slogan. Yes, a political party in Germany in the 21st century actually using a Nazi slogan. That is really, really scary stuff. So there you have it. Me, a Sky News presenter, endorsed by the ABC's Media Watch.
Hello, Australia. This is John Lennon of the Beatles here. I hope you're all having a great time over there.
This is Paul speaking. We're hoping to come over soon and visit Australia.
This is George. That's if you move it a few thousand miles nearer. Hello.
That was Ringo, folks.
Well, what can I say?
And goodbye.
Now, did you know that it's 60 years ago this month that the Beatles first came to Australia? So I thought, for a very special treat, I'd give you the real story on what happened when the Beatles came to
Wet,
town.
cold and windy, and some 3,000 or 4,000 teenagers have been waiting, many of them right through the night, to welcome their idols, the Beatles, from Britain.
Now, they arrived in Sydney at June 11, 1964, about 6:30am at Mascot International Airport, rather grandly named. In fact, Mascot International Airport had only had paved runways for the previous 10 years. Prior to that, it had gravel tracks on which the planes would land. The Beatles touched down. There were about 1,000 people, screaming fans, plus another group. They had a banner that said, "Go Home Bugs," and they called themselves the New South Wales Anti-Trash Society. Got a feeling I'd love those guys. Anyway, the Beatles went off. They did shows in Adelaide. They did shows in Melbourne. They came back to Sydney. And the shows they did in Sydney was at a place called Sydney Stadium in Rushcutters Bay. Spoiler alert, it was not a stadium. It was an old boxing venue that was known as the Old Tin Shed. And it was basically a tin shed. But of course, the manager of the stadium didn't want the Fab Four to know that, although it was more like the sort of Fab Three, because I think Ringo was sick in London, but it was well by the time we got back. So we got the full complement here in Sydney. So the manager's wife, Dawn, redecorated, refurnished the backstage dressing rooms for the Beatles so that it would look super, super swish, super, super spesh, and they'd be so dazzled by all the mod cons that they wouldn't notice that the rest of the venue was pretty much falling apart. This included the revolving stage. Because of all the electrical wiring that came through the center of the stage, it meant that the stage couldn't actually revolve. And when you're a revolving stage, revolving is a pretty important part of what you're meant to do. So what it would do, it would revolve almost a full circuit, and then just before it had pushed all the wires and twisted them and pulled them from their sockets and electrocuted the entire crowd, a bunch of people would manually turn the stage back in the other direction, and I guess hope that if they did it slowly enough, no one would notice. Another fun fact about the Beatles coming to town was that the Melbourne promoter Ken Brodziak had secured them a year earlier, halfway through 1963, when no one really knew who they were. They were very, very obscure. They hadn't really made a name of it. But in the intervening 12 months, of course, they'd become absolute global superstars. So when Ken Brodziak had actually negotiated this deal for them to come out to Australia, he got them to come out for £1,000. Yes, we didn't even have dollars back then. £1,000 a week. £1,000 a week for the Beatles. Now, you're saying, oh, look, come on, back in those days, £1,000 was a lot of money. Yeah, well, in today's money, it'd be a bit over £30,000. £30,000 a week for all of the Beatles. Now, by the time they got to Australia, they were able to command, in today's money, more than $830,000 for a single performance. So one performance, $830,000. To give you an idea, in the Old Tin Shed, they played 6 performances in 3 days. And again, they're here for $1,000 a week. But of course, Ken's not an unreasonable man. He's not made of stone. And so when they finally came out and their global superstars would say, hey, Glenn, normally we get $800,000 a concert, and you've got us here for £1,000 a week, it doesn't really seem right. And Ken said, you know what, you're right. And he generously upped their fee to £1,500 a week. Well, that's all we have time for. Thank you very much for listening to The Real Story. If you like what you hear, leave us a rating, give us a review. And if you want us to cover anything on the pod, reach out via our socials. Oh my God, I'm talking like a millennial. Our email is therealstory@novapodcast.com.au, or you can slide into my DMs on Instagram. My handle is Joe_Hildebrand, and I'll chat to you next week. Bye for now.